Hi there and welcome. This week it had been my intention to explore why it is senseless to engage on a case, or really have any avoidable discourse at all, with persons who are either functionally insane or simply dishonest, whether that be in the emotional sense or through financial motivation. In the first case, it is not just a fool's errand, but dangerous, I believe. In the second, a waste of time, energy and emotional resources, pure and simple. That is going to have to wait though, as after watching Peter Hayes' eye-opening video on Wednesday, that task has been overtaken by considerations which must be given a higher priority. That is not just from a therapeutic perspective either, though I was left stunned, reeling and heartsick from some of the information shared, and most of all the implications of that information when looking at the bigger picture, looking back into the past, and looking with increasing foreboding into the future. Peter Hayes' talk was the most intellectually engaging information I've come across in a good while. Engrossing and compulsive viewing, totally fascinating in delineating the perfect parallel between Miss Letby's experience and the original pseudo-rational witch-hunting principles developed and relied upon to condemn women who were disliked in the 16th and 17th centuries. Many of us have used witch hunt and related terms as pejoratives based on an intuitive sense of commonalities between the original witch hunts and what has been done to Miss Letby. Never in our worst nightmare did we realize that the thing really was an unqualified return or revival of witch hunting. So far so shocking. But I am not using your time today to talk about the fact that Miss Letby has had the identical investigative and judicial experience of a 17th century witch, bar being burnt at the stake, of course. No, I have to draw your attention to another revelation in the video, which constitutes an even more heinous attack on a person than a conviction being engineered in full knowledge of total innocence. That thing is the erasing of an event from a person's life. This is to interfere with the substrate on which personal identity sits. It is an assault, therefore, on our very sense of who we are. There is also another subject I must and will speak on. 2/3 of the way through Peter Hayes' video, I found my sensibilities being pummeled by a blow-by-blow account of the reprehensible Johnson KC perpetuating the most drawn-out, sadistic and traumatizing act of sexual violence not involving blood that I've ever witnessed. It was something which diminished as human beings Miss Letby, the victim, himself the perpetrator, and every other person in that courtroom. Why? Because they all now carry the knowledge that they witnessed it without intervening, or at least expressing silent protest by leaving the room. To not act in such circumstances carries the same moral imperative of vicarious responsibility as a non-participatory presence at a physical rape or a public lynching in the old deep south of America. My primary motivation for denouncing it at the earliest opportunity after learning of the event is intuitive moral knowledge that the said vicarious responsibility extends to every person who learns of it, the operative word here being person. I was immediately tainted by this. We are all tainted by this. I cannot for the life of me work out why there hasn't been there's been no outcry over it. I can only think that those ladies who are aware of it have been so traumatized by themselves that they have repressed the memory. For this man to have gone uncensored for that leering violation of Miss Letby violates just about every value I hold dear. My first subject, though, is the altering of Miss Letby's police mugshot. Tears in that situation was an expression of who she was then and therefore an affirmation of that identity. We naturally change as persons with the passage of time anyway, which is why memories are so precious to us. They are the things which connect us to earlier versions of ourselves, allowing us to simultaneously track the changes we undergo on our journey and giving us a coherent, continuous, and integrated sense of self over time. Our memories are both an inalienable right of our personhood and things without which personhood is not fully experienced. The right to our lived experiences through our memories is a part of the inviolable dignity of simply being human. As individuals, we can, of course, choose to put that fragile connecting chain of the self at risk through the use of recreational psychoactive substances. Human agency is the freedom to choose your own path to hell. But no other individual or institution has any rights in this area. It is really the ultimate attack on the person. Miss Letby's tearful response to finding herself taking a police mugshot was an expression of innocence. Innocence in the sense of still having the emotional sensitivity to shed tears of distress when finding herself in a situation she could never have expected to be in. If the forces of darkness do go through with their plan of fabricating new charges from her time as a trainee at the Liverpool Women's Hospital, she is unlikely to feel tearful when taking a new mugshot. That isn't so much as that she is now 7 years older, as the fact that in the interim she has been betrayed by police, by the Crown Prosecution Service, trusted colleagues she considered friends, the judicial system, her own defence team, and her own government. Her sensibilities are certain to have been deadened by those lacerations. More so than the rest of us, then, Miss Letby will never again be the person she was 7 years ago, but she has the right to cherish the memories of that younger self. That right is violated by anything which threatens the certainty of recall, like the official record being at odds with her personal recollection. In photoshopping the mugshot, the authorities didn't just erase those tears, an expression of Miss Letby's identity, it erased an event from her life. Putting to one side the possible implications for Miss Letby's mental well-being from future uncertainty about the event, to focus on the moral implications of the act, it speaks volumes. It shows an entity willing to violate the personhood of an individual, the inviolable dignity which is inseparable from being members of the same self-aware species, for an objective which, even if the outcome of the trial had not been prearranged, could never have had any bearing on the evidence given to the court or the jury's deliberation over that evidence. We therefore have an entity willing to accept as collateral damage in the securing of window dressing for its evil the most extreme psychological violence imaginable, a partial destruction of personal identity. Further, from the perspective of society at large, the manipulation of the image reveals an entity with no more regard for truth as a thing to be valued than it has for the sacrosanct personhood of each of us as individuals. The purpose of altering the photo was to give society a representation of Miss Letby's personality that was both less than her reality as an emotionally alive young woman, and more than that reality, in that it sought to substitute some other less sympathetic quality for the erased emotional sensitivity. We are therefore talking about an entity which no longer recognizes the inalienability of an individual's value simply from the fact of being human, and also does not recognize truth as a cardinal value. Such an entity, it can be categorically stated, is therefore one which sees itself as standing outside and beyond human values. If it was ever the case that it gave expression to human values in regulating our lives in society, it is certainly now divorced from them. This existential threat to us is not Cheshire constabulary. Given that the local newspaper is the only known source of the undoctored mugshot, that is pretty conclusive evidence that Cheshire police were happy to release it. It also had to have been released to all press at the same time, but it was the nationals where it didn't appear. That would suggest to me that whoever made the decision to alter the photo simply overlooked the Chester standard. A person working for Cheshire police would be highly unlikely to have made that mistake. Even using the hypothesis that the photoshopping was local to Cheshire police, what are the options for those institutions further up the food chain when one lower down goes off reservation in such a way? They are three. 1. Publicly set the subordinate organisation straight in a virtue signalling way for the benefit of the watching public. 2. Quietly return things to the way they are meant to be, in this case, pull the fraudulent photo and replacing it with the original and stonewall anyone who notices or noticed. Or 3. Take no action. The Association of Chief Police Officers and the Home Office are the only institutions I can think of with anything approaching with regulatory power over Cheshire Constabulary. Patently, both went with the third option, doing nothing, which amounts to approval and sanctioning of the dubious activity. The trip off reservation becomes de facto policy made on the hoof. Further, the Home Office is the state. The British Home Secretary is the commander of the nation's police force, all police, in exactly the same way that the US President is Commander-in-Chief of the US Armed Forces. In fact, behind the appearance of taking no action, what we actually saw, and continue to see, is the establishment, which is the public persona of the state, the expression of it in human society, nothing more, nothing less, repeatedly doubling down on the wrongfulness of the original pseudo-rational witch hunt started in the consultant's office at the Countess of Chester, with what Peter Hayes aptly describes as a second witch hunt of a judicial media nature. This includes, of course, the Charles K. sham retrial, the farcical but dangerous inquiries at Liverpool Women's Hospital, the censorship and sanitation of the internet regarding information about the case, and of course the Thirlwall inquiry. Some of you might be asking yourselves what the big deal is about evidence that the individuals who embody the British state now apparently feel unconstrained by moral, ethical, or any other human values in what they do pursuing their objectives. The big deal is this. What it boils down to in practice is that all bets are now off in relation to what the future will hold. Miss Letby's case evidences that the certainty under the law, which has been the cornerstone or hallmark of civilization since antiquity, isn't just in play, but is now back in the pocket of the banker. If that could happen, it means that certainty in property rights, a thing never, in my knowledge, previously challenged in the history of the British state, is now in play, along with everything else supposedly protected by law. If looking at the case in its entirety makes it difficult to see that certainty under the law is gone, look no further for something more specific than the abuse of the legal provision for restricting media coverage pre-trial in this particular case. As Paul Hayes reminds us, the gagging of the British media on the reporting of the growing disquiet over the case involved blatantly and outrageously reversing the principle justifying contempt of court censorship. Reporting restrictions were introduced to protect defendants. On this occasion, however, The Home Secretary sanctioned its use to prevent the tsunami of information challenging the science and the statistics from derailing the objective of giving Miss Letby a 15th and the 15th and most scandalous conviction. They didn't even feel the need to alter the wording of the provision, which is unambiguous. I quote, "Censorship of discussion of impending trials conflicts with the right to free speech. In this conflict of law, the only legitimate reason for upholding censorship is to uphold the right of the defendant to a fair trial before an impartial jury." End quote. They simply altered reality overnight, arrogating a meaning to these words diametrically opposed to the clear semantic one, knowing that even those citizens who noticed wouldn't be able to protest it because they could be, and no doubt were, simply silenced by censorship. This is naked and unapologetic totalitarian power, sufficiently secure in the centralization of all authority and executive power in itself, and most importantly, its ability to control information, that it now does openly what was no doubt previously done surreptitiously. I do not use the word totalitarian lightly. Over the past 250 years of Western civilization, I can identify only one other instance of a country being ruled by an elite devoid of human values, the Bolshevik regime. A regime which first undermined the Russian state, then proceeded to destroy every aspect of Russian life, from culture and society to people who had education or were simply physically attractive. I kid you not. It was a gang of criminals which placed itself above people, above the population, law and values. Here is the head of the Communist International in Drasnaya Gazeta of September the 1st, 1918. I quote, "We will make our hearts cruel, hard and immovable, so that no mercy will enter them, and they will not quiver at the sight of a sea of enemy blood. We will let loose the floodgates of that sea. Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. Let there be floods of the blood of the bourgeois, more blood, as much as possible." End quote. By enemy and bourgeois, Zinoviev, known to his family and the world up to that point as Hirsch Apfelbaum, wasn't talking about foreigners. He was talking about the 90% or so of Russian citizens who happened to still live on the land and therefore didn't meet the criteria to be deemed proletariat or proletarian, part of the proletariat. Apfelbaum wasn't some crackpot loose cannon either. He was totally on message. Here is his boss, Lev Bronstein, who around the same time decided he preferred the world to know him as Leon Trotsky. I quote, "We must turn Russia into a desert. We must turn Russia into a desert populated by white Negroes, upon whom we shall impose a tyranny such as the most terrible Eastern despot never dreamt of. The only difference is that this will be a left-wing tyranny, not a right-wing tyranny. It will be a red tyranny, not a white one. We mean the word red literally, because we shall shed such floods of blood as will make all losses suffered in the capitalist wars pale by comparison. The biggest bankers across the ocean will work in the closest possible contact with us. If we win the revolution, we shall establish the power of Zionism upon the wreckage of the revolution's funeral, and we shall become a power before which the whole world will sink to its knees. We shall show what real power is. By means of power and bloodbaths, we shall reduce the Russian intelligentsia to a state of complete stupefaction and idiocy, and to an animal existence." End quote. They did too. Over the next 5 years, Russia was the biggest charnel house in history, with some 15 million dead through the Red Terror and state-engineered mass starvation. By the second politically motivated famine 10 years later, there are records, still in Russia, of butchers being, and by butchers I mean people who sell meat on the high street, being prosecuted for selling human meat, and parents in court for using their own children as a food source. I'm not saying this is going to happen in the UK anytime soon, just that in all the circumstances, it is quite possible that history will come to show that what happened to Miss Letby was the very thin end of an enormous wedge. Turning now to the reprehensible Johnson KC, this is sexual violence, no less impactful or traumatizing than the physical variety. It may even be more so. Had Johnson's sexual assault been a physical one, Miss Letby would have had the small consolation of her shaming by him being witnessed by only one other person, himself. In this case, though, it was done in the presence of dozens of people, including her own parents. This was sexual violence, not for any personal advantage or gratification, but as a paid mercenary. His go commando emotional torture was a rape. He took her to a place of the most private, personal, and intimate aspects of the identity, in a public forum where she was already on trial for her life and publicly vilified by the nature of the charges. He knew that as a person institutionalized who would have had her dignity repeatedly violated by strip searches and quite possibly intimate searches, whatever sense of privacy she still had, purely in her mental life obviously, would be the sole basis she retained for whatever tattered remnants of human dignity she had managed to preserve. He deviously, therefore, gave her the choice of sacrificing that last remaining piece of privacy, and therefore human dignity, to address a trivial question which did not relate to the crimes she was accused of, and, on the face of it, had no bearing on the assessment, should have had no bearing on the assessment of her innocence or guilt. Johnson knew that for her to recognize a question as legitimate and address it accordingly would involve her active participation in placing the thought of her most intimate body part uppermost in the consciousness of every male in that courtroom, including her father, and subsequently the millions reading the newspapers. A woman cannot speak about even the very idea of, and that's all it was, of going without underwear in a public forum without immediately sexualizing herself to every male present. Every young woman will resist with every fiber of her being such sexualization against her will to a gathering of persons which includes strangers and even her own parents. Johnson likely has daughters, nieces, or sisters. He knew that there could be no more mortifying prospect for any young woman not employed in the adult film industry. He knew that she would be further intimidated in her response by her knowledge that he, a person standing 4 feet away, a man standing 4 feet away, leering at her and actively engaged in malice against her, had already stripped her of that last remaining piece of dignity in his own mind in simply framing the question, and had done so with such relish. He deliberately, in front of the whole world, asked her to go to a place that no young woman is psychologically equipped to go to. It was no different to trying to force a teenage girl with body morphic disorder to walk naked down the centre of Oxford Street on a Saturday afternoon. What did you understand the question to mean? This is not questioning, it is torture. It is a sadistic little boy inside an emotionally repressed man pulling the wings off a butterfly. He knew that ego-defensive avoidance is the refuge of any young woman under such extreme stress in relation to an intimate matter. I can't say right now. And the equally sadistic goss sat there and did not intervene. Is that moment a candidate for the historical low point of the English judiciary, or will Thirlwall give him competition when she reports? This was calculated sexual violence. He deliberately and repeatedly violated her, returning to the go commando thing later in cross-examination, then being brass-necked enough to remind the jury of this violation of his by him of Miss Letby in his final summing up. As stated, Goss, to his eternal shame in my opinion, hopefully not just mine, sat there and allowed Johnson to do this. What Johnson did may have passed by some of the male jurors, but the 8 female jurors, I am certain, would have been no less discomforted than Miss Letby by the go commando sexual abuse, if only in a kind of feminine sympathy. They obviously later repressed the memory, as I just can't see them giving Johnson his convictions after witnessing such sexually predatory behaviour from him. But that's by-by. Benjamin Myers too deserved censure. Where was his objection? Taking the moral line he would have taken had it been his own daughter being subjected to such sexual violence, is likely to have won Miss Letby's sympathy for the emotional distress motivating her avoidance. Myers had to take this bull by the horns and spell out why a straight answer would be to become party to her own humiliation. At the very least, it would have prevented the feeble-minded and emotionally retarded from treating her evasion as if it was to either a proper serious question about the case or a totally innocuous question, instead of something that went to the core of the need for the illusion of personal privacy we all have, especially young women, in relation to intimate matters. So, that was what I had to say today. Difficult subject, difficult to do, needed to be done. You, as usual, feel free, share your comments, your own thoughts below in the comments rather, and any information you think might be of interest. Thank you for watching. Appreciate it's probably been a hard watch. It's a hard world. But thank you for your time and all the best.